We will kick off today's speeches with our first speaker, Dr. A. Vasudevan. Dr. Vasudevan will speak on monetary policy challenges for realizing Vision 2020 in the context of the global economy. To quote the Dalai Lama in this context, in order to carry a positive action, we must develop a positive vision. A bit about Dr. Vasudevan. He is the Honorary Fellow of the Center for International Strategic and Development Studies in Mumbai. He is the former Executive Director of Reserve Bank of India and was in charge of economic research, statistical analysis, monetary policy, and information technology. Dr. Vasudevan's international experience includes, amongst other things, being an advisor to the Executive Director responsible for India at the IMF and a member of the delegation of the IMF World Bank meetings, a member of the Task Force on International Standards and Codes at the BIS, that's the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. He was also special advisor to the Central Bank of Nigeria, a G20 deputy of the RBI. Well, some of you may have heard this comment. After the G20 summit, which was held in Pittsburgh, a reporter asked Americans what they knew about G20, and the majority said, we think it's something to do with Gatorade. Now, Gatorade is a sports drink, but I'm confident that our audience here is much better informed than the average American.
Thank you, Mr. Malkani, and for the invite and for making so many good arrangements here. May I thank the chairman, Mr. Sanjay Gupta, vice chairman, and the members of the committee, and all those people who helped in making this particular conference a success. May I also say that all the protocols, I assure you, are observed. Thank you. Now, this particular title is slightly longer, and I believe I've been given about 45 minutes, of which I think 5 to 10 minutes have been taken away by my earlier speakers. So I'll have to cut short some of these slides, but in any case, I don't believe in following the slides very strictly. But in any case, that's fine. Most of these references that I would make are to the Indian situation, no doubt. But I wouldn't speak only about India. Let me assure you that. Because, when we talk in terms of emerging market economies, we really speak in terms of not merely India, but also a number of other economies, like, for instance, Russia or Brazil or South Africa and China, of course. And therefore, there will be some references to that. But then there are also a number of developing countries which are what they call frontier economies. Frontier in the sense that they are very close to the emerging market economies. They would become emerging market economies one day or the other. And therefore, the structure should be, really speaking, at one time we used to speak about emerging market economies, EMEs, but now the latest version is emerging and developing market economies. But China doesn't fit in exactly that way, but still, because they do follow the financial markets to a large extent, it's a part of that setup. Now, essentially, when we speak again on this particular theme in the context of the global economy, which is a wonderful topic indeed, I must congratulate you, Mr. Gupta, for that. We do speak in terms of dualistic structures. One is the advanced economies on the one hand, and then there are the emerging and developing economies, market economies on the other. The issue that really, when we look at the dualism, which is the more critical of it from the point of view of global financial crisis? The criticality is actually in the emerging, not in the emerging economies as much as in the advanced economies. Because the advanced economies fail in their performance, to a large extent it is reflected in the performance of the emerging economies. And therefore, though China is more or less second in terms of the quotas now practically in the IMF and the World Bank for all good purposes, still it is not regarded as a very critical player compared to, say, the United States. Now, let me not get into the issue of who really started the crisis here, global economic crisis or global financial crisis, ultimately ending up as global financial and economic crisis. It is often referred to as a Great Recession, but not as a Great Depression. The Great Depression took place in the 1930s, although comparisons were tried by a number of academic economists. Essentially speaking, we do speak in terms of Great Recession in the sense that there is a large amount of slowdown, and to an extent some of the formulations that are made at the time of the Great Depression were taken in, but with a lot of modifications. Now, okay, there's a brief sketches there. Yeah, that's right. These are basically the sections under which my discussion will be there. One is the current global economy developments. The second is the Vision 2020, which I need not really bothered about it, but then I think I got a kind of a tip from Mr. Gupta that maybe that we may have to tweak a little bit. The word tweak that he used was very interesting. So I thought, let me just put that Vision 2020 in, which really I don't believe much personally, but this is my personal feeling. Okay. Then the current economic context and the challenges. The fourth is the institutional settings and the governance mechanisms in I think I must make it later change. EMD is not a correct word. Emerging and developing economies is the correct word. Monetary policy changes, the case study of India to an extent, and perspectives for the short to medium term. Now, under each of these sections, again, I have subsections. The subsections are the US, UK, Germany, and most advanced countries have not returned to the normalcy or normal. The word that is used nowadays is the normal, not the normalcy. Still high unemployment rate, low stagnant growth, inflation is quite low, and it depends on now this public sector stimulus. Some of you who were in India in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and maybe even the 80s perhaps, to an extent, do know about the importance of the public sector, private sector linkages, and that's why I just put that depends on the public sector stimulus. Let me take to the next slide on this particular topic alone. This is the advanced economy's progress is based on, most of the data is based upon World Economic Outlook document, which is brought out by the IMF in October at the time of the IMF World Bank annual meetings. And to some extent I added the Economist statistical page, which is a wonderful page where you get a snapshot of most of the data. Let's just look at this particular advanced economies here. USA, UK, Euro area, major ones at least, and Japan I took it because it's a part of G7. What's the group of 7 major industrial countries? And in any case, it's one of the important players in Asia. Now, the first column is the average growth, 1995 to 2004. Why did I take that particular period, 95 to 2004? Partly, of course, it was given by World Economic Outlook, but it's also because it was regarded as the period when practically the entire world prospered. It's called the period of great moderation, although the word moderation is a little bit of a kinky word, but then the reasons are very simple. There was, before 1995, somewhat of an erratic trend in the advanced economy's growth and performance, both in terms of employment, both in terms of growth, and also inflation. Therefore, what they did was the period of great moderation, which was largely driven by the IT and high technology sectors. And this 1995 and 2004 gives a very wonderful picture. The average growth rates are quite high in most cases, excepting and these estimates are important. USA is regarded as one which is now recovering to a large extent. It is likely to post 1.5 according to the estimates, but it may or may not necessarily be 1.5, it could be 1.3 to 1.5. UK may at best go to 1, but it is even still doubtful. Euro area is going to be negative, and that is the greatest worry, really speaking. And that negativity is 0.7%, is largely contributed by France and Italy. And of course, there are, of course, countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal and things like that. And they are really doing extremely badly. And in fact, some of the data that if you look at it, it's abnormal. The third column is the unemployment rate. And this particular unemployment rate, the current one, which is the estimated one, is 7.2% to 7.3% actually in the United States. The latest is actually 7.3, but it is assumed that by perhaps the end of December, it could be 7.2%. UK is 8, but in reality, it could be even 9. Euro area is very high, 12.2. Italy being the 12.5, and again, France is 11.1%. Japan is probably much lower at 4, but then the 4 is also quite high because of the fact that the Japanese population is an aging population, which is of course likely to happen in many other countries too. If you look at countries like Greece, where the unemployment rate is about 27.6%, look at the kind of unemployment. Spain, 26.6% at this point of time. These rates are very, very high, much, much higher than what may be called the natural rate of unemployment. That's what most economists will talk about. Now, this unemployment rate is the one which creates a lot of complications. What really happens is that when you see such a huge unemployment, people would say that don't think in terms of austerity measures. Go in for a larger amount of stimulus, and the stimulus should be given by the public sector or by the government, to an extent supported by the central banks. Now, these austerity measures are being largely opposed by the civil societies, and that's why you find a lot of these rancorous arguments and debates in Europe, and of course, to some extent, also initially in the United States, what is called this Wall Street demonstrations. And it could be not necessarily only due to austerity, but also due to governance mechanisms failing. Now, let me just look at this particular thing in terms of the averages. The averages are, in fact, very, very low with regard to the unemployment rate. In fact, it used to be something like about 5% or 4 to 5% in the case of United States. Now, the next column is the inflation, which is 2013 estimate. What you will find is very interesting thing here. And in fact, I think my friend Salim Gangadharan is going to speak on this issue. And it is an interesting thing because in advanced economies, inflation has not really gone up very much. Okay? It is much less than 2%. Much, much less than 2%, in fact. And therefore, whereas we see it in developing countries and emerging countries, very high inflation rate, it is not so in advanced economies. And that is the one which is really creating a lot of difficulties for those economies who are brought up in the traditional world of the so-called trade-off between inflation and growth. That's really the greatest problem that we face, particularly in the monetary policy makers. Now, the averages, if you look at it, they are much higher than the rate in general. Barring, of course, UK. UK is going to be much less than 2 ultimately. It's 2.5 is a little bit of a vulgar high, but it could be probably much lower than that ultimately. Japan practically, in fact, it is probably the negative inflation rate at this point of time, but they just gave it as 0.0 and I took it as it is, but basically maybe it may be even negative inflation rate. Now, the reason why I am emphasizing this particular inflation rate is, please remember that there is now going to be, and I am sure that Mr. Salim Gangadharan will probably ultimately pick it up at some point, and there is an argument that inflation rates, most central banks should think in terms of targeting it at 2%, which is supposed to be the one which gives incentives for producers to produce goods and for consumers to tolerate. So there is what is called the margin of tolerance, as an economist said way back in 1959. That margin of tolerance is supposed to be given by the so-called 2% band. There are, of course, a lot of inflation nutters all over the world. And so that particular 2% now, they would like to, in fact, there is an agitation among many people to raise it to something like about 4% or 3.5%. And that is why I thought that let me just put this idea here while explaining this particular table, which is a very interesting table in my way of looking at it. And then there is a 10-year bond yields, which are in fact slowly going up over a period of time. But at this point of time, in countries where there is a huge public debt, the 10-year bonds always go up. It is so in the case of Spain, it is so in the case of Italy. It is so to an extent also in the United States, because there is a feeling that the debt sustainability issue in most of these countries is a problem now. And so the argument is that you do think in terms of bond yields, because these bond yields give you an idea that inflation expectations are high in future over maybe 10 years period, and the financial assets values will therefore be falling down. So there will be an asset crash, values crash on the one side, and the inflation expectations going up, which is of course a very dangerous scissors crisis kind of a thing if one goes through the old Russian model of 1924. Now, there is a story about the financial sector problem which is not explained over here, which I should add up as a kind of an argument here. Almost in all the advanced economies, financial institutions have not yet become very strong. There are still uncertainties exist about their strength, and therefore the international community as a whole has become very conscious of the fact that there is a need for getting out of the problems that were created in 2008 onwards, right up to 2012, and therefore they believe that one must go through what may be called a more strict observance of the international best practices. Of course, having experienced that particular thing in Basel at one time myself, I had a little bit of a problem in understanding what is international best practices. And most of them that were all coined by the Western world, to a large extent fell through because the people who really wanted the best practices to be there didn't observe them. It is not necessarily only the accountants or auditors who are responsible. There are also insurance guys who are responsible. The internal audit guys were responsible to a large extent. Even the pension guys are responsible. And raters, international raters are also responsible. And let me also say, even the economists did not do the job well, because they could not really predict what is really happening. In fact, there was a story that when Queen Elizabeth visited the London School of Economics, a number of economists went and then asked the Queen that how do you feel situations in the UK? She said, I feel they are really terrible now, very bad. But tell me, how you brilliant economists, why did you not predict and tell us about 2-3 years earlier? Probably would have taken measures to address these problems. But it never happened anyway. So, but then the story is also getting to be a little tougher now with regard to financial problems. Look at the kind of arrangement that JP Morgan recently made with the Justice Department of the US. They were willing to pay, I think, about $13.4 billion for the so-called misdeeds they did with regard to the mortgage-backed securities selling. Now, together with Bank of America and JP Morgan, ultimately, according to some estimates now, the latest estimates, is that it might be even going up from maybe anywhere between 14 billion to about 40 billion. And then you also know the story about the Barclays Bank, which created an enormous problem with regard to the manipulation of the LIBOR rate. Now, whom do you believe this kind of a story? Now, many of us in the emerging and market and developing countries who are used to having LIBOR as a kind of a benchmark rate. Now, if benchmark rates themselves are getting managed, if not manipulated, I mean, because of the unparliamentary word maybe, manipulated by these guys, then it creates a lot of problems for anybody, any policy maker. There are, of course, uncertainties. This I can just go quickly through. There's continuous of stimulus given by the advanced economies is not certain, at least in the short term. Maybe in the medium term it could be there possibly, but then I'm not very certain about that. And the concerns do exist about the fiscal deficit. How long can they go about that? And there are also concerns about the interest rates, that are being administered now in the advanced economies. The zero bound interest rates that are there in the US, UK, and many other countries, and ECB, for instance, is creating a problem for them. Because the normal theoretical argument is that if you reduce the interest rates, investments will pick up, and then there will be growth rate. Because there is a fantastic theory model called the Harrod-Domar model, which we all studied as students in the 1950s, that the Harrod-Domar model simply says there's a growth rate will go up depending upon the investment rate and the productivity of investment. Okay? Assuming the productivity does not change in the short run or in the medium term, what you normally do is you increase the investment rate in order to have the higher growth rate. Now, the argument that, well, growth rate can go up with the interest rate being reduced was now proved to be wrong. And zero-bound interest rate has now become a nuisanceable value. Therefore, what has happened was they went in for what may be called the quantitative targeting or quantitative variable changes. And this is where not merely the fiscal deficits gave the stimulus, but also the central banks gave stimulus in terms of what is called the quantitative easing or the credit easing, and liquidity facilities being extended very largely. For instance, in the case of US, there is what's called the term auction facility, which is extended to almost all the commercial banks. And in the case of UK, they were willing to have some of the low-quality assets changed over to the high-quality assets, and they were directly lending without really changing the value of the low-quality assets. Now, of course, there are also special liquidity schemes, and there are a lot of direct funding, for instance, to the primary dealers and things of that sort. Now, they also assured the world that don't worry about it, we are going to purchase assets, long-term assets, to the extent of about 85 billion every month. And that is the Fed's resolve in the markets. Now, in case that don't want to follow that particular so-called tapering, the tapering of the purchases of the long-term assets on a monthly basis from 85 billion to say something like 50 billion, what really happens? This tapering, this particular purchases has created one interesting situation. People who get the money, the banks and others who get the money, they started investing in emerging countries and developing countries. So the foreign investment flows were coming in. So as a result, for instance, the stock markets boomed in many of these countries between 2008 and 2012. And when the stock markets boom, many of us will think that, well, I think the business is doing very well, exceedingly well. That's supposed to be a great signal for businesses to go flourish. And the latest argument is that this tapering may continue or may not continue. The present chairman, Ben Bernanke, in fact said that by September, we would probably start tapering. At that time, when he made that announcement, sometime in May, there was a problem in the stock markets in many countries, including India. So the stock markets dipped, but it's only afterwards when in June, July, when they realized that the unemployment rate is still high, the economic recovery in the United States is not very certain, and there is a problem with regard to the private sectors getting the adequate amount of support to bring about some reduction in the unemployment rate. That they said that, well, the tapering will not take place right now, they will probably postpone it. And I will come to that particular aspect a little later about the tapering issue. Then the period up to which the austerity measures will be on to reduce the public debt to GDP ratio is again an uncertain factor. But then the austerity seems to be paying somewhat of a dividend, particularly in Spain, particularly in Italy, to some extent. But then the austerity is also done with some amount of careful thought. They are not doing it all out. They are doing it in somewhat of a phased manner. So to that extent, it is quite good. No one therefore predicts that things will change in the remainder of this year, and there may not be any significant deviations from the present in the quarter number 1 of 2014. Much depends, of course, on the new chairperson of the Fed. May I just go for the next one, if you don't mind? Yep. Okay, thanks a lot. The third point is about the dependencies of the emerging developing economies on the global economy situation. Many economists believe that the quantitative easing, QE, brought about a balance in the global financial markets. To some extent, this is true. If there had been no QE, then there would have been a real serious crisis in the advanced economies, and that would have definitely led to a larger amount of crisis in emerging economies. Why do you say so? You might just ask me this question. In fact, if you carefully go through the documents of 2008 and 2009, both of the Government of India as well as of the Reserve Bank of India, one of the important points that comes out is that these economies, which depended to a large extent on what is called the external demand, knew very well that because there is a slackness in the growth in the advanced economies, they will not be able to depend on the external demand. So what they had to do is they had to overheat or heat up the domestic economy, and therefore they had to give the domestic stimulus, which meant that you had to increase the fiscal deficit, you had to also increase the liquidity facilities, reduce to an extent also interest rates, if not wholly low, like what they did in the United States or the UK or even the ECB, but to a large extent make it a little more accommodative monetary policy and accommodative fiscal policy. So that stimulus had to be given for the domestic economy so that it would at least depend less on external demand and more on domestic demand. Now, in case the tapering takes place, what would happen? Immediately the stock markets will have a problem, so you have to probably continue with liquidity. Can you do that given the kind of inflation rate? Inflation rate is very high in India, even now. Consumer price inflation is almost about 9.5%. It could be double digits soon. Barring China, most of the countries did not do well in the emerging countries. Now, unemployment rate is still high, and therefore some people believe that, well, till the inflation rate moves up a little bit, unemployment rate comes down, we will not go in for tapering. One of the arguments, very interesting argument made by Janet Yellen, who is going to be the future chairperson of Fed, in the Senate hearings, confirming her ultimately as a chairperson, was that she said that probably we may not be able to even do it in December, tapering. Maybe it may be done later, because unemployment rate is still a problem. So that is the one issue that perhaps comes out quite clearly from her testimony. The tapering of purchases have to be therefore calibrated, partly because the 10-year-old bond yields are going up, and also because of the emerging countries' progress could slow down further, in which case there will be some problems, and that might push down the global growth rate further. And then there is, of course, the issue of emerging countries having a high inflation, and there's a fall in the possibilities of trade volumes, and there's a deterioration in the terms of trade, TOT, and there are, of course, supply-side problems owing to the climate change. Now, if we assume that the slowdown in the global economy is likely to continue in 2014, there is a great problem for many of the emerging economies as well as the advanced economies. Although, if you look at the World Economic Outlook, they place it at a very, very high rate for 2014. They in fact place it somewhere at about 3.6% growth for all economies, global economy. And that is what sometimes worries you, because, is it that optimistic a picture that you really get it? Now, can we just go to the next one? Now comes the famous Vision 2020. I must say that in Nigeria, where I was for some time special advisor to the governor there, we used to have a lot of discussions on Vision 2020. The idea of Vision 2020 came up in early part of 2000. In fact, if you read this first bit of it, the birth of the vision around 2000, policymakers thought that in about 20 years, countries could continue with good macroeconomic and structural policies to extend the period of the great moderation. And each country, of course, defined Vision 2020 depending on its national aspirations and its potential and available resource management endowment. Most of the countries' aspirations are placed so high that it's difficult to defend them. Countries in general emphasized on agricultural growth, technology upgradations, and financial sector development, development of manufacturing sector with high-class infrastructure in different combinations of all of this. Everybody wanted excellence. And in fact, some countries in Africa said we should be one of the first major 20 countries in the world by 2020. Okay? So, there is a problem anyway of this particular kind of an argument. Can we just do that? The vision documents should actually they do deal with objectives of development. But the objectives are placed so high, you must always talk in terms of instruments of policy. Do you have adequate instruments of policy or not? Do you have an institutional arrangements to ensure that these instruments of policy are effectively utilized or not? And what are the legal requirements required to buffet these instruments of policy? And this should be also within a particular time horizon. There is no use saying that, well, we are going to tweak these institutions and they are going to tweak the legalities and all that stuff. But basically, sometimes the governments will say that we are going to bring about a law to take care of certain things, but given the kind of democratic nature, in many cases, this is just not possible. They might do it at the last minute when things are really bad for many legislators, but possibly not. Now, technical exercises in respect of Vision 2020 are extremely limited. You can think in terms of models, but these models create econometric models, basically. These econometric models are based upon sometimes very spurious logic, particularly the rational expectations, as they call. Everybody is very rational, which is not necessarily true. And some people think that markets are perfect, markets can never fail. There is another kind of an argument that some people make. The third is that there are no financial frictions, which is again a problematic situation. Therefore, there are a lot of governance issues that come about in this area. In all the documents, there is one particular commonality, namely, financial sector development is important. Because finance is, of course, a lubricant of development. Yes. It also means that there will be financial innovations, new products will come up. But then, mind you, the same products, like for instance, mortgage-backed securities or asset-backed securities, or even the credit default swaps, or any kind of securitization that is not done without proper regulation, had created a lot of problems and stresses and instabilities in the banking sector. Now, they have to be addressed through proper regulatory framework and technology adaptations. Otherwise, enormous amount of frauds can take place and technological glitches can take place and gridlocks, and with a lot of spillover and contagion effects. And then spillovers and contagion effects can take place also because the market participants or market players may not observe the rules of the game, which is in fact one of the major ingredients of good governance mechanism. And when they don't follow that, as they did in 2006 and 2007, then the problems arise. Now, poverty reduction is of course mentioned in many 2020 documents, but I think it's basically rhetoric. But then the strategies are never spelled out. And therefore, the distributional effects that one really gets when there is unregulated capitalism could be enormous. In fact, an exceedingly wonderful recent report, I think it came out only about a month ago, or maybe even less than that. Yes, I think it is less than 1 month, by Merrill Lynch. This is the Global Institute of the Merrill Lynch people. They brought out a very wonderful report about the distributional effects of even quantitative easing. In fact, they do believe that the distributional impacts are going to be very large, because the rich are still richer even now with all this easing that took place, and the poorer have become much poorer, as a result of which the disparities have increased, and with unemployment rate being so high, the poverty reduction has become quite a problem. Therefore, what do? You require to have some kind of care systems that have to be brought in. Now, I would personally think that Vision 2020 is an interesting concept, but maybe some a bright, smart guy will say that let us just make it to 2025 or 2030. It might happen. So 2020 could well become a passé. So that is that. Now let me just, the economic context and challenges. Again, I have got a number of subsections within that. So I can skip the next section, if you don't mind, next slide, and then I can just go straight away to the current economic developments, domestic developments. Yes, please, go ahead. 10 minutes? 6 minutes. Oh, you are very tough. You took away about 10 minutes of mine. I know that. That's what you say. Okay. Now, EDE, okay, anyway, I'll just take this one. You can, in fact, read it out basically, but basically, I always think that the statistics has much story to give. The story is always behind the numbers, and the numbers are very important. And 4.9 growth in the period of the Great Depression, now it's about 4.5, thanks to two countries, China and to some extent India. Though by Indian standards is much lower. There is a question. Then there is an average inflation rate of about 13% at the time of Great Depression, Great Moderation. Now it's about one half of it, but then to a large extent it is due to India and Brazil and to some extent in Russia. Now, China is probably the lowest in respect of inflation rate. There are, of course, others where I put deliberately Bahrain more as a kind of an example of this particular situation here. They are doing quite well with regard to growth, with regard to inflation too quite well, and so is perhaps Saudi Arabia. But perhaps some of you people know better than me on this issue. CAB is nothing but the current account balance, that is the external sector balance. Now, current account balance is in the balance of payments. The current account will normally be deficit in most developing countries, but then the deficit should not be too high in comparison to the GDP. Now, anything goes beyond what is, say, 4% or 5% in many developing countries is regarded as unsustainable, simply because the imports are much higher than the exports of goods and services together, put together. What will happen is you have to think in terms of strategies to push up the exports and somehow de-incentivize the imports, not necessarily putting the bans, as they did recently here in India. Now, you look at this particular thing. India is likely to be probably having about 4% current account deficit. Brazil is going to have 3.4, and China, of course, is much less. South Africa is very, very high, 6%, which is just unsustainable. So the bugbear right now for most of these countries is inflation and to an extent the current account deficit. In general, the BRICS countries have not really done well. Now let me just go, Mr. Patra, I will try to follow you as far as possible. I'll just go through it because I think this can be even skipped up because, you know, if it comes to that, you can just say world trade volumes have really become lower and their numbers are there. The international context, again, fiscal implications of stimulus for advanced economies and EDs, to a large extent spelled out to many of you. And the second is that EDs will face problems. The EDs will face problems of sovereign default or large private debt because of capital. They did not face problems of default because of capital controls and limits on foreign holdings of debt papers. And this is one thing which really came out of the Asian crisis. The Asian crisis did state that not only the short-term foreign debt should be low, it is also that you should think in terms of some kind of capital controls to see that the foreign debt really does not go up. And you should have capital controls. In fact, at that time, in 1997, we had a IMF World Bank meeting in 1997 in Hong Kong. I was, in fact, a witness to the terrible debate between two people. The Soros on one side, somebody like Mr. Batra, very strong man. And then Mahathir, president, who is like me, basically. But then I had to have an intellectual battle with Soros. Soros practically came out, I'm going to just see to it that everything tumbles there if you have capital controls. And unfortunately, Mahathir said very clearly, Soros, try your luck. It will not happen. Capital controls will be there. To an extent, he gave a wonderful lesson. Thailand did not follow that. Thailand had got into problems. Indonesia, to an extent, did not follow. But Indonesia had a very peculiar problem. So also Korea, because they did not have, really speaking, proper data of external debt statistics. That is a problem that they had. But Korea and chaebols, for instance, they took a lot of loans from outside. But when the private sector commits that kind of fault, unfortunately, they think that, well, governments think that, well, it's the private sector which took loans, not me. But when they default, the country's name comes under dispute. So what happens is the disrepute has to be somehow corrected. The countries try to salvage the situation. So there is a problem of that nature, and then I think we learned quite a bit of lessons after the Asian crisis. And then the present crisis has created a problem of large balance sheet problem for the central banks. Now, the balance sheets increase, and this will influence the prices of domestic assets, because when actually the balance sheets increase, that is, assets go up, the liabilities also will have to match up to that extent. Now, there are problems of this kind of nature, that both as the depositors, there is a problem for the commercial banks, there is also a problem as lenders, you see. Therefore, what really happens is the credit spreads increase, term premium goes up, and the long-term interest rates also go up because the inflation rate will go up. And then because the central bank money goes up, liquidity will be pumped into the circulation, and there will be price stability problems in the medium term, and this could even crowd out to some extent the private sector banking. This will have an implication upon what we call it as transmission channels of policy. That is, whenever we take a policy measure, we should be able to say what will be its transmission effects on the ultimate goal. The goals may be price stability, growth rate, and financial stability. So the growth rates, you will have to prepare a matrix wherein on one side you spell out the objectives, on the other side you spell out what may be the instruments of policy. Depending upon the instruments of policy, each one of them will have to emphasize certain particular objective. Certain objectives cannot be emphasized by every instrument, and therefore certain instruments will simply emphasize, certain instruments merely recognize certain objectives. Now that's the kind of a thing that will happen. Okay, go ahead. Next one. CB's growing assets will be exposed to the market. I think you can just take it off. Okay. Institutional setting. This is my favorite subject, actually speaking, and I was.
I'll give you 5 bonus minutes.
Thank you very much. You have been so kind. I now realize that you are a good central banker. You might become a governor. Accommodative central banker. Okay. But that's a misfortune, okay? You will have really a problem. Be careful. Decision-making committees, the fiscal budget and the MPCs, what they call monetary policy committees, liquidity assessments in central banks and financial stability committees in the Basel process, coordination issues. You can just go next to the one, if you don't mind. Okay. Decision-making committees, in the fiscal sector, the first point, no, you can go ahead. Next one, please. In the fiscal sector, there is the budgets, because they believe in secrecy of the budget document till it is really presented to the parliamentarians or legislators. Now, because the first information should not be got to a private sector, that's what they really mean. Now, therefore, there will be some, but then that does not mean the finance minister is such an endowed person that he can just decide things as he likes. There will be prior consultations with the business sector. Without committing themselves, they will say, oh, wonderful, we got a lovely feedback from you. We will just try to consider all these things. They also consult some of the economists, particularly those who are regarded as experts in fiscal area. So they do consult number of people, and then they will try to prepare the budget. That is the kind of decision-making committee. But I must also say this, as one who was involved with the history of the Reserve Bank of India volumes, I did write one of them at least, to an extent, partially, and then later became the technical committee advisor for the latest volume. But basically what really happens is that we do consult bankers as central bankers. We do consult also economists. And then they will come to a conclusion. Whether there should be a different methodology, that is, you only consult those people who are probably going to say, yes, sir. When a governor calls the chairman, normally, the chairperson finds it difficult to say that, no, this is not my viewpoint. So basically, it becomes extremely difficult. So the bosses play a very major role. There's a centralized kind of system. Many countries have got a centralized system. Many countries don't allow any outsiders to come in and give advice to you. But then there are countries, including Nigeria, for instance. They have got what is called a Monetary Policy Committee. It started first in New Zealand. It went to UK. And everybody started saying that you should only have outsiders. And misfortune is that most of them are academics. Okay? And I'm not saying that as a comment, because I was myself a university teacher in 1960s. And later, of course, became a visiting professor after my retirement at a university. But that is not the issue. The issue is very simple. Academics do think in terms of theories and really don't look at the practical issues as much as they should in developing countries. In many of the advanced economies, many of the academics in between go to the government sector, work for some time, come back to the academics. So there's a lot of give and take in those particular economies, which is not the case in many developing countries. And that is where the problems arise. So the MPC, what we call Monetary Policy Committee, may not be a great idea, but then there are some views about it. It's probably about 10 years old in India. There is what's called the Technical Advisory Committee, the views of which on monetary policy are not binding on the governor. In fact, I was a member of it for 2 years and then I gave it up. I realized that it's absolutely waste because it doesn't make sense to me. And this is, of course, after retirement. But basically, this is a big problem that you have always with them. But then there are liquidity assessments, the second point, in central banks, and that is done daily. In fact, during the time of Asian crisis, the liquidity assessments were done sometimes twice a day. Why do you do that? If there is a need for liquidity injection, the central banks can take a decision. Then take a decision whether we should intervene in the market or not. And that decision has to be taken by central bankers at the highest level only on getting certain proper feedbacks from the financial markets departments. They are the persons who tap how things are going about in various markets, whether currency markets are doing well all over the world, what should we do in the foreign exchange market, whether there are problems with regard to gilt-edged market, that is the government securities market, whether there are other kinds of problems elsewhere. So that is very important from the point of view of banks. And now the financial stability committees, which have now come much more prominently after 2005, much more prominently, that is now being very much advanced as a major issue. And here, there is some obfuscation of issues, really speaking, in many developing countries and many emerging countries. Because many countries, those countries which have got public sector commercial banks would like to protect their turf. The turf is that the Ministry of Finance would like to be the ultimate setter of what is the financial stability norms, whereas they are not really the supervisors. They may not be also regulators. And so when a financial stability committee is headed by, say, the finance minister or the minister of state for finance, then there are problems. So the coordination issues become much more serious, and that's what the fourth point is. And the central bank, governments, and financial regulators, sometimes what happens, financial regulators, again, insurance guy is appointed by the government. Pension fund is appointed by the government. Securities, SEC fellow is appointed by the government. Everybody wants to play to the dictates of the finance ministries. So the coordination issues become much more serious, and that is where one has to be very careful with regard to even the choice of people. I think ideally you should go in for some kind of an American system where the Senate grills people and then finally comes out with some kind of solutions. That is being done in Nigeria, by the way. Let me tell you that. That's the one good thing in Nigeria that we did in recent years. And we have got MPCs, and MPCs differ with the governor. And they come out very openly with the voting system. And that kind of a transparency is required. Now comes the monetary policy. In fact, that is the major thing for me. Now, new challenges. You can go next one. Doesn't matter. New challenges due to recent global crisis required new ways of tackling liquidity, market and operational systemic risks. Insolvency is not a major issue in most developing countries and most emerging economies. But it was so in the initial stages of industrial economies or advanced economies. Now, the challenges are very simple. How low should the interest rate be? Should it be zero bound? As it happened in Japan in 1990s, they could never get out of it. And many banks have really got into stresses. So, One of the arguments recently made by Oliver Blanchard, who is now a big name now, both as an academic as well as a counselor of IMF, said that monetary policy now is going to have a new challenges and new change of phase. Yes, that is true. But should the interest rate be so low as zero bond? Should one have quantitative expansion without giving any kind of an idea as to what should be? How much should be the collateral policies? This is a very interesting thing. Central banks are not supposed to give loans to any commercial bank without a proper collateral. And a collateral is normally taken as a very high quality asset, and that asset is supposed to be the sovereign government securities. Most countries, USA, UK, all the advanced economies, have relaxed those collateral policies. This has happened for the first time in the last about 80 years. It never happened earlier. There are any number of writings on this particular subject by economists of Britain as well as of USA that collateral policy should be very strict. Now, what should be the case? Should we water it down? In which case, what will happen? The central bank will get all the useless collateral with them. They will not know what to do with it. And how do they handle it ultimately in their balance sheets? What is the kind of risk perceptions that they have on their own balance sheets? Who will support them? These are the questions that come about. And what about reducing the liquidity ratio itself? Liquidity ratios exist essentially in developing and emerging countries, not so much in other countries like advanced economies. And whether it should be 23%, 24%, 30%, whatever it is, whether it should be reduced or not, so that the banks can make a choice. In fact, economics is nothing but economics of choice. So the choice of assets is most important. So whether they should go in for some other assets or not, that's an issue by itself. But then, if the housing market or if the real estate market goes up or the stock markets go up, don't go in and invest there because there is always a danger that they will fall down. Anything that goes up must fall down. It's a typical Newton kind of a formulation. So therefore, what happens is that the regulations to eliminate exposures to risky assets both at home as well as abroad is important. Exposures to the mortgage-backed securities was responsible for the problems in UK, Iceland, Ireland, Spain, Italy, and to some extent in Germany, and to some extent in France. So the risky assets abroad, held by the government, held by the banks, had been responsible for this kind of a problem. Then comes the objectives of, you have gone farther. Okay, MP debated whether it should be single objective, whether it should be only inflation targeting or something else. I think Salim will handle it, therefore I don't need to worry about that. There is a particular rule. That rule has been there since 1950s. A very famous economist by name Jan Timberson, who produced a rule called that you must have only one objective if you have got only one instrument of policy. That instrument of policy was determined as only rate of interest at one time, and therefore they said only rate of interest can only handle inflation and therefore have only one objective. But that is no longer the case. Something like people said that if you have got a very big bank, it will never fail. Too big a bank can never succeed necessarily. That is the latest argument now. Is financial stability more critical than growth in periods of slowdown? Obviously not. Market men, of course, believe so. Unfortunately, market men think that growth is only an incidental objective. It is important to have only financial stability and price stability and nothing else. Many academics, of course, now think in terms of what is called the, we have got what is called the dynamic general equilibrium models, which you just produce lots of models with all these kinds of things, econometric models. And they put the financial stability as one of the factors in it. Essentially, these really don't work. But the international world has realized that what is important is think in terms of proper regulations, because the cross-border exposures are very important. And therefore, you think in terms of Basel process, which is crucial, and that particular process is now Basel III, which is likely to take place before 2018. Many of the countries have already started implementing it. Capital base, for instance, has been raised. Buffers have been increased. And those are all, of course, details which I would not like to know, because given the kind of limitations that we have got here. Micro and macro prudential policies have to be made consistent with the monetary policy. because at one time we used to do only supervision of banks and then say that this particular bank is weak and therefore do this. But macroprudential is also important in the sense that what is the total leverage that you have got in the banking system as a whole, so that you can think in terms of stress testing for the entire banking sector. Now, I think probably that will be also dealt with by somebody. And now comes the last of the two. I think India's case comes over. And that Indian case you can always see. But basically, the Indian case now is that in general, the NPAs are increasing. The net non-performing assets are increasing in time, over a period of time. And that is now going to be a major challenge. And therefore, this is, of course, much more so in public sector banks. But then there is no threat of any kind of financial insolvency. And the central bank has in general taken a decision that there should be still a financial inclusion. So you widen the banking net, you broaden the banking net, and think in terms of financial innovations. I don't know how it's going to be ultimately turning out. There's a committee which is now sitting over that. And then the current challenge is that more than the central banking world, it is, of course, the government which also has to cooperate in terms of reducing the fiscal deficit and seeing to it the current account external deficit is at least under control. And in general, the India's external vulnerability indicators are very, very high. And that is one thing which comes out in one of the tables here. And the recent challenges now look upon things like this. Much of it depends upon the external sector developments, whether tapering is going to take place quickly or not, whether the growth rate in advanced economies is going up, whether the world trade Doha round ultimately comes to fruition or not. And then you have, of course, fiscal deficit reduction is an important thing. Then, of course, there is a kind of a revisit of the entire monetary policy framework. The framework is not merely a theoretical issue. It is also a question of implementation committees. And in general, most central banks don't come out as to how far certain decisions which are taken have been really implemented and what are the results in the short run and the medium term. And those scenarios are never given. Much depends upon prudential policies and monetary governance. Now, looking forward, a lot has been said here, but a lot has been unsaid because of the time constraint. And big thank you for your large patience. I am ready for questioning and ready. Thank you very much. You're a tough man.